Okay, looks like audio is working. Let me make a small announcement. Okay. So before I share the screen, let me do a bit of a recap verbally on where we're at and where we're going. We have been building an OAuth integration into a Rails application from scratch, right? So we're not using Devise, we're not using OmniAuth. We are writing the controllers, the routes, the HTTP client, all ourselves directly in the code of our Rails application. For the last 3 sessions, we have been building out the foundations of that code. So we finished that up yesterday. And what that means is that we have a user's new route in our application to initiate the sign-up flow. We have a session's new route in our application to initiate the sign-in flow. Both of those routes have a button to, right, build a form that will submit a post request to our provider authorizations controller. And this is when we begin the OAuth flow. So that controller redirects the user to the provider's sign-in page, the OAuth authorize action or endpoint. We include a number of query parameters to let the provider know which consumer or client application we are, where we want them to redirect the user to in our application when they complete signing in and authorizing permissions. And we then defined the controller action, the route, for where the provider redirects the user to, right? So this is the provider authorizations show action. And there we receive a authorization code. We take that authorization code, we convert it into an access token by making an HTTP request to the provider's service to convert authorization codes into access tokens. We then take that access token and use it to authenticate an API request, which gets the user's details, right? So that's everything that we've built. And what I want to focus on today is thinking through what resiliency additions and enhancements we can make to that flow. Like, where can things break, and how can we handle that in a way that is useful and intelligible by our users. So let's share the screen, jump over here really quickly. Let's jump into the code. And what I like to do when I'm thinking about resiliency is to walk through the code step by step and think about, can something go wrong here reasonably, right? Like, of course, at any line of code, the server could be unplugged, right? Our application could go down. But here, since we are integrating with a third party, specifically what I want to think about is what kinds of things can go wrong in the integration and interaction with this third party. And then how can we respond to that responsibly? So we will start here with the create action. And there's not much to it right now, right? So we just immediately redirect to the authorized URL. Let's hide everything we're not working with. So let's jump down to this method and let's think about if anything can go wrong here. So this is a static line of code, and this is basically static, but let's think it through. So obviously completely static here. Here, something could go wrong in that our credentials could be missing in an environment, right? We could forget to put them for production. We could spin up a new staging instance and not have them for that staging environment. So that's the problem. Let's think about what kind of error that would throw and how we want to deal with that. So at a high level, there's basically two kinds of responses, right? When it comes to the user, I want to think about everything from the end user's point of view. We can raise and show our 500 error page, right? Like something has gone wrong on the server and we will look into it. Or we can rescue and show the user a friendlier page, right? We can redirect them and sort of restart the process and walk through it. In general, my thought process for which of these two routes to take, pun unintended, is if we restart the user on whatever flow they are taking, is there a reasonable chance that if they go through that flow again, things will go successfully? Because if there isn't, then we're setting the user up for a very frustrating Groundhog Day-like experience. So in this case, if we don't have the credentials set up, then it doesn't matter how many times they try to go through the OAuth process, they are always going to hit an error. So I don't think it makes sense to redirect them back to the sessions new or users new page. I think in this case, we want to angrily and loudly raise an exception so that we see it in our error tracking service and we respond to it, right? But if we hit this case where we don't have credentials, then we just have to get that fixed. We have to deploy those credentials. So this is a route helper method. Similarly, if we don't define that route, nothing can be reset. This is a constant pointing to a string, and this just generates a string. So everything here looks pretty static, right? Not a lot of surface area for things to go wrong. Of course, we could provide improper data here, right? We could like have a typo in our client ID in the credentials, in which case the provider will respond with some sort of error state. But we're going to have to know specifically how the provider reacts in that situation in order to determine how to properly respond and react to that. And that's also the kind of thing that can't intermittently happen, right? So that's the kind of thing that we should absolutely be catching in pre-release QA. So in terms of writing code to make this system more resilient, I don't think that we have anything here in this create action that we need to address. So let's turn to the show action. So we've already started making this system more resilient with our verify state method. I'm just going to collapse this code as we go. So there we are ensuring, using Rails's CSRF protection through authenticity tokens, that the state parameter is valid, right? And we rescue from an invalid authenticity token to redirect the user to the start and provide them with an error message. This is the kind of pattern that we want to follow. There is, though, a second possible error state that we aren't handling presently. And I only know this because I have run into this error state myself in like QA and reminded myself of it. And it's lurking right here in this line, in line 92. So when you fetch from the params object in a controller, right? And this is an action or an action controller parameters instance, this params value here. If you don't provide a default, right? So you just try to fetch. If that parameter does not exist in that object, right? So if we think of that object as effectively a hash, if that key is not present, then an error is thrown. And that error is action, parameter missing. That error is the action controller parameter missing, right? We can see here, if you set up parameters hash without a B key, and then you try to fetch the B key, you are going to get this parameter missing. So since our authorized URL is passing a state parameter, we are expecting that the provider will return that state to us in order to authenticate that we are getting a new request that is completing the second half of the OAuth flow from the provider and that it matches the request that we sent out. And so if that state parameter is missing, something has gone wrong, but we would hope that things would go correctly if they restart, right? Like, who knows what might have happened there. I think it makes sense to I don't know why the indentation does that. To something like this. So this verify state method can throw two different errors. Yes, invalid state token. Can throw two different errors. So at line 96, it could throw the parameter missing error, or at line 97, it can throw the invalid authenticity token error. We rescue from both and send the user back to start the whole OAuth flow over from the beginning. The next line after verify state is request access credentials. And I put a bang here because this method can throw an exception, right? We're using our application client to make a post request, and HTTP requests can throw exceptions. Let's look at how the application client works. Right, everything delegates to this make request object or method, sorry. And make request here at the end handles the response. If we look here, if we get a response that is not in this set of 200 response codes, we raise different exceptions. If we come up to the top, we will see the definitions here. So when we make this HTTP request, we might hit an application client error. And we similarly want to make sure that we report that error and reset the OAuth flow. So how can we do that? Well, the simplest thing, yeah, there we go. Thank you, Copilot, is to add a rescue block around our show action itself. And to do the same basic things, right? We want to report our exception and then issue a redirect. And we can just report back whatever the exception message is, if we decide, right? We could also like hide all of these things and just provide a very generic error message that we're not leaking too much internal information. This is a decision for you to make in how you are building things. We could also, though, we looked at this yesterday. I think it was, yeah, here, canceled logins, right? We might get an error from the provider, right? So instead of something like a timeout error or a connection dropped error, the provider could respond and say something went wrong on our end, and they might provide an error message. And if we are showing error messages to the user, we might want to forward that along. So just to show what that would look like, so our exception, let's go back to handling, right? When we raise these errors, we get a few different structures, and some of them just return the response body, and then the generic one returns the code, and then a dash, and then the response body. So how could we handle this? Well, there's roughly two options. I'm thinking as I go here. One option is that we could do 2 rescue blocks. And in one, we rescue all of these errors. And in those examples, we know that the error message is going to, well, we don't know, but like we presume from our provider that it is likely to include a JSON payload, stringified. And then in the other one, we rescue this and we do like a split and grab this part and try to JSON parse that. But I don't love that. And what I was thinking is maybe the better thing to do here is to adapt how this generic error is set to do something like this. And allow the message to just be the body again. It has been a while. Ruby exceptions. Let's define a custom exceptions. Since I've done this, so let's go in and read up a little bit. So as we have seen, right, you can always specify a message just by raise and with a comma. If you set up an initializer for your custom exception, you can set a default message. And as we get in here, right, you can add custom data attributes to your exception. Yeah, this is what we want to do. So let's come up here. So we want to define this error class. And we want to have a code like this. So when you initialize a generic error, you let's make this optional. That way I don't have to change all of these objects as well. You can set a code and then just pass the message up. And so now down here, where we do this, we can pull that code out if we want when we rescue, but we also just have the message. I think that this will work. So pull this out and we do JSON parse exception.message like so. And if we are, don't need to do anymore. Using this example, then here, what we would say is message. Yes, it looked at my clipboard. Way to go. Hey, happy to have you on board. So this allows us to forward the error messages that are coming from the provider if something goes wrong. But we do also, at this moment, introduce another area where things could go wrong, right? Because we are now expecting that we are going to get back a JSON payload as the exception message for whatever application client error that comes through. And there can be a wide range of them, and they might not all have JSON payloads. Some of them might have empty messages, in fact. So in order to make this resilient, we should ensure that we handle situations where we don't have a JSON payload. That works. So we could go this route. We could also go this route. And if we wanted to go even more resilient, we can do this. So now we're handling 3 different scenarios. So the first scenario is that we get some kind of application client error, but it does not have a JSON payload for the message. So if there isn't a JSON payload for the message, we're just going to show whatever the message is. The second scenario is that our application client error does have a JSON payload for the message, but that payload doesn't have the error description key. In that case, we'll show the full message again, which would be a JSON blob. And then the final case is that it's a JSON payload and it has the error description. This is one way you could go about it. We could also, of course, tweak this in a number of different ways. We could say, in a situation where we do have a JSON payload, but we don't have an error description, I don't want to show a JSON blob, right? We could give a different default here, right? Something like that. We could just generally not show any sort of message here specific. We could just say request failed, drop all of this, right? And what I like about owning this code is that it is so much easier to make the flow, the user experience of that flow, precisely what you need it to be, what you want it to be for your application. You're not limited by the hooks that OmniAuth gives you. You're not constrained by the flexibility that the underlying gem allows, right? You're not stuck with having to debug and resolve problems that the gem didn't foresee. It's very clear and very straightforward for you to deal with bug reports that come into your error monitoring service and say, oh, yeah, okay, we had that application client error. What do I want to do? Like, what do I want the user experience for that to be? And you could end up with like a whole case when in here. You could have multiple different rescue blocks. You could rescue different errors. You could say, okay, for the rate limit, I actually want to show a different alert, or I want to redirect differently. Or like you have total control. And it isn't complicated, right? This is very standard Ruby. This is very standard Rails. I really like that aspect of taking ownership. The nice thing about putting this rescue block here in show is that it works for both HTTP requests that we are making inside of this method. We could, of course, again, right, if we wanted total control, if we wanted to do something slightly different, if an error happens in request access credentials than if an error happens in requesting user info, we can move these down. We can have separate rescue blocks inside of the different methods. The flexibility it's just Ruby, right? Like, we know how to refactor this code. We know how to work with this kind of code. For right now, I'm going to have a generic response to any kind of HTTP error that occurs when showing the end state of the OAuth flow. But if we needed to get more fine-grained, we know precisely how we would do it. So here we have HTTP errors. We handle those HTTP errors with this rescue block. Down here, we have the potential for active record errors. So we're using the bang methods here. And in this case, I actually have to go and remind myself, like, what is the base active record error? If you know, you can write it in the chat. I'm trying to think, like, what's like the single thing I would rescue from? Rescue something like that, maybe. This is the kind of thing where doing some QA could be useful. I honestly don't know. I haven't had these problems myself, so I haven't actually written this rescue block, but it's worth thinking through. We could have a whole host of kind of errors here, right? Like we could have database timeouts, we could have database locked, we could have the database schema has changed and we didn't update this code, and so this field is no longer named this, right? There's a whole host of possible errors here. Again, you want to think through and address, right? Like which of those errors are showstoppers? So you just want everything to blow up. There's no way you can reset the flow and things will go differently. And which of those are intermittent errors, right? So if you got an error like the database was locked, start everything over. It probably won't be locked if the user runs through OAuth again. If you updated the schema, but you haven't updated this code, it's always going to fail. So throw a big error and make things blow up loudly, and then go and fix that problem quickly. So write different rescue blocks for the different kinds of errors, or write rescue blocks for errors that you want to rescue. So in this case, like if the record is invalid, it's like always going to be invalid. We could do something like, if the database is locked, we want to retry that. Same kind, right? We can just write a generic rescue block or sets of rescue blocks or rescue multiple errors. And we would do the same things, right? I'm going to pull that out because I don't know the errors that might be thrown, honestly. And this is the kind of thing I would push into QA, right? Exercise the system, try to break it, and go from there. Here, again, we have like a sort of standard controller flow where we try to save the record, and if we can't save the record, then we start over and explain what went wrong, since we don't have a form. So kind of basic stuff, but I think it's useful to like sit down and really think through, and to I wanted to take the time to communicate like the value. I think this is one of the main values of taking ownership over the OAuth flow in your application, is the control and flexibility that it gives you to deal with errors. It makes it very clear, A, that like those errors are your responsibility. I can't go and open a GitHub issue on a gem. I wrote this code. This code lives in my repository. If I am working in an application with a team of 50 developers, there's immediately an implicit, clear signal that it is our team's responsibility to make this code work, because it's our code. It lives in our repository. I think I have seen across multiple teams, right? That the implicit signal when you are relying on a gem and something goes wrong is that, oh, there's a bug in the gem. Do we have time? Do we have the interest to go and report that bug, make a good reproducible example, like deal with it? I don't know, maybe not. We try to work around it. There is the sense that like that's their problem and their problem is causing us a problem, and how can we solve our problem, which is separate from their problem. When you own the code, it's very clear that it's your problem. And then that leads to a natural sense that we have full control over the user experience. And we can make that user experience precisely what we want it to be. I want to commit this. On that topic, got a few more minutes here. We can go maybe 20, 30 more minutes of making the user experience precisely what you want it to be. One thing that has been implicit in what we have been doing, which is, I think, technically a bit wrong for how we've set up our authentication system, we are acting as if the only possible starting point for the OAuth flow is the new session path. But that is not true. Let's come here. Users new. And the way we have set this up, you can sign up or you can sign in. So if I came from users new, right, and I see I'm signing up, and then a problem goes wrong. So for example, let's just put something in. I end up on sessions new, which says sign in. That doesn't feel right. So this is a enhancement, or maybe just a bug fix, I guess, depending on your perspective, that I think we need to make. We want to allow the show action to be polymorphic, to handle different entry points and respond to them gracefully. So how do we do that? What does that look like? Well, it comes back to create. What we need is we need to keep track of where did we come from in order to allow us to use that information later in show. So how do we keep track of something across requests? The tool, this isn't quite right, but it is the tool that we use. We put things into our session object. And in a action controller, this object here is different from an instance of our session active record model, which we also have. This is the sort of action controller helper that is sitting on top of and providing an abstract interface for whatever our session store is. Like by default, it's a cookie store. That's what we're using. So it's the browser's cookies, but you can set it for different things. You can use Redis, you can use the database. Right. So this is that object. This is not our sessions table. But what it allows you to do is to keep track of things across requests. That's what we need to do. So that's what I'm going to turn to. We don't need to store the state. What we need to store, I like to call this the origin. Yeah, this looks good. So what we can do is we can have our two different forms include a parameter to differentiate themselves in our create action. And we take that parameter and we put it in the session. And then here, we can get that value out and reset our session. This is a pretty common flow. This is how the session is often used. Put something in the session at one point and pull it out and delete it at another point. Let's go into here and we can simply do this. Actually, let's use symbols for this at this point. So now, when we start this, we have this parameter. We take that parameter, we're going to put it in the session. We're going to pull it out of the session here. And we can inspect it, make sure that this worked. We might have to debug it. I'm not 100% sure why we hit that error last time, so we might have to debug that, but let's jump into it. Yeah, so what is going on here? Hey, Anakin, this is the Z editor. I've been using it for a few months now, and I'm a fan. I think here at the very end, yeah, I agree. I really like having a built-in terminal and oh, right. I committed this. Yeah, okay. I added that there to sort of force us to explore that path. Okay, so that's not really a problem for us right now. We get it back out, origin, sign up. Okay. So this works. And what this allows us to do now is we can differentiate. So we can say, we can set a redirect URI, and we can check If origin not present, then well, I'm just going to do this with if else end. All right, so if we have our origin, then we can say if the origin is sign up, like this. Otherwise, go to new session path. So here we are defaulting to new session path, right? We presume that most of our requests that initiate the OAuth flow are going to be to sign in and not to sign up, right? That's just sort of statistics. A user signs up once and signs in n number of times. So in aggregate, sign-ins are a much larger number than sign-ups. If you're just launching, right, you can like inverse these. Again, you have total control. But we set this redirect URI, and then down here, let's actually call it redirect path. And then we hit the next sort of stumbling block, which is like, I've got this variable, which is in the local scope of show. I need to redirect stuff up here. How do I solve this? Ruby. We make it a method. So now we can definitely call this method from anywhere. It's not local scope. And all of our error states now go to redirect path. And let's try to force ourselves to get into an error state. I can probably just do it here. Well, I can do that jumped really fast. I wanted to intercept that and change the state parameter. Let's just do it down here instead. Verify state. For some reason, my brain always gets super confused with unless keywords. If not, so when this is true, if true, it doesn't do anything. So if I do this as true, so if I do and false, I think this will trigger. Authentication failed, invalid state token, nice. And we're on sign up, right? Perfect. This time let me remove that so that I don't have a bit of code in the code base that is forcing a bug to happen. Let's come back here. We can do a commit now. The other thing that we can do here is at the, let's come in here. Similar to like, where do we go when things go wrong, right? We want to have some dynamicity there. We might want to have some dynamicity on where we go when things go right. We talked about this at the end of last session. If we had a RESTful resource and it was behind our authentication constraint, right? So you had to be signed in to view it. And you had a bookmark, or you just typed the URL in directly, right? So I'm trying to go to resources index. We have application authenticator. Let's go to routes. And in addition to root, let's say get home, like that. Okay, so now we have this home route. So if we try to go to home while we are signed in, like everything is good. If we sources. There we go. We sound ourselves out, right? So I was trying to go to home, that URL. I sign in with the provider. I get taken back to root, right? But I want to go to home. That's where I was trying to get. How can we set that up? Let's clear out some of these things, right? So we want to make this bit here. Ooh, I missed one. We want to make this bit here similarly dynamic to our redirect path. And we want to change this name now that we're thinking about this as well. So we want to do something similar. And we need to sort of think through this, right? So what's the flow? I make a request to home. As a part of this before action, I redirect to new session path. And from new session path, I redirect to create. So I need to do something similar here. I need to keep track of where was I coming from. Thank you, Copilot. So if we are trying to visit a route that requires authentication and we aren't yet authenticated, we want to keep track of where we are going. I'm using these short variable names for now. We could like make this redirect to after all, like, you know, whatever a good name for this is. There's a name in Devise. We could probably copy that. I don't recall it off the top of my head. I haven't used Devise in a while. But the point is, this is the moment in time where we have access to that information. And then down here, let's check that we have it. Sure, let's do both. I don't mind. So I want to perfect. I'm signed out. Okay, so I'm trying to go to home. I'm try to visit home. I get redirected to sessions new. I sign in. And let's come back here. There we have it. Our destination path, right, was home. So we have this. We can now come up here and we can say, after success path, just like this. Except like this. Now, I don't need to make this a method because we're only calling this inside of this method, right? So there's not really a need. And then we make that replacement. So now, just to test it, all right, sign ourselves out. We try to visit home. We get redirected to sessions new. We sign in. We get signed in, and we are taken back to home. All right. Nice. Let's make another commit. Successful. This is that next part of sort of enriching the user experience. And this is another example where, again, in my opinion, having everything in your application makes this kind of work, I think, faster, easier, simpler, and more resilient. I know that there is an integration with Devise and OAuth where they will do this for you. The issues there are that if you take one step off of the beaten path that Devise and OAuth have set up, then it isn't going to work. But what's worse is that you don't know what the beaten path is unless you go and look for it, right? You have to know, like, what is the way in which that code is written. And that requires going and reading. Like, you have to go out of your way to like get a sense of like, what is the beaten path? So you're likely to stumble blindly off of the beaten path, off of the golden path, right? You have no idea that you have changed something that Devise and or OAuth were relying on to drive this particular behavior. And now that behavior is gone, you're getting bug reports. And when you go to fix those bug reports, you're going to be starting from a place of great confusion because you have no idea what change was made. And right, and like in a production application with a whole team behind it, you're a good team, you're doing things the right way. So you're doing continuous delivery. You have like 4 deployments a day. Which change, right, caused the problem? Right? This is the classic, very confusing bug of like spooky action at a distance. You did something over here, you had no expectation or anticipation that it would have any kind of negative effect on this behavior over there, and yet it has, and all you can see is the behavior over here, and you've got to figure out which of the myriad of changes you made had that spooky action at a distance. And that's the thing that I have grown overly frustrated with. And it's what has driven me to really embracing the power and the flexibility of taking ownership over the authentication system of my application. And I can learn a lot from Devise. I can pull in a lot of their code, right? I'm very happy to copy and paste. But when I'm copying and pasting, I make sure that I understand what it's doing. I make sure that I have a clear mental model of like what my system is doing as a whole, how each of the pieces contribute to that, right? To say, okay, I know why this line is here. I know what it's doing. I know how it relates to this line over here. It is greppable. I mean, we can make this session key much more explicit. I'm moving quickly now. I'm just using this metaphor of origin and destination, but we can make it distinct, make it highly greppable, right? So we can just pop in and, find all, right, this line of code is related to that line of code because these are the two lines of code that are dealing with that key in the session. Very easy to find all of the places that deal with it. And very easy to find because all of that code lives here. There's not code off in the OmniAuth subdirectory, the Devise subdirectory. That code is going to be much more abstracted. It's not going to be using this name. It's going to be using probably a variable, and that variable is doing some computation, like a whole thing, because they have got this configuration. All of the detritus that gets added up to in these gems to make them configurable and flexible so that the full suite of developers that are using them who each have like, oh, I kind of want to do this, I kind of want to do that, like over time, especially these older gems, right? They just have so much and they're doing so many things and you're using like 20% of it, but you're inheriting all of that code, all of that complexity. You have to read through all of it when you're debugging something. It's just not worth it. Okay, sermon over. Where we are at now is we have a resilient, sufficiently resilient, right? A pretty resilient, pretty flexible, pretty clear OAuth flow. Nice. I think this is a great success. What I want to do tomorrow is I want to take everything that we've learned and I want to build a real OAuth flow with an actual third-party provider. I'm not sure which one yet. I'll do a little bit of experimentation tonight, see which one is like the easiest to get up and running with. So I want to add another one. And after that, so I want just to get a sense of like, once you sort of know what you're doing and you know what to look for, like here's what the kind of things you want to be paying attention to in the documentation. And also just to show how simple and quick it can be. And then at the end of that, I want to start talking about what I think is a healthy mindset, a healthy philosophy to have around drying up that code, right? So like once we have let's just say it's GitHub, our provider authorizations controller, as well as our GitHub authorizations controller. And there's necessarily going to be a number of similarities there. Do we want to dry that up? If we do, how do we want to dry that up? What's the approach I think makes the most sense there? So that'll be tomorrow. We'll build a authorizations controller for another provider, an actual third-party provider. And we will explore how that looks, how that goes, how we can test it, and then what that leads to in terms of how we want to architect our code when we have multiple different OAuth integrations in our code base. So thanks for hanging out again. This was another just like solid hour, trying to keep these like right around an hour. Got through everything I wanted to get through. Really happy with where we're at. Hopefully come back tomorrow. We can finish this series up and then we can all start taking ownership over our authentication systems, our OAuth integrations, and I think in the long run, make our lives much easier, much more pleasant by having full control, full flexibility, full awareness over what our systems are doing, how to debug them. And I think in the long run, this is going to be advantageous for all of us. So let me stop sharing the screen and I'm going to end the stream. As always, thanks for hanging out and come back tomorrow. We'll finish up this series and actually like build a real authorizations controller for something like GitHub or Twitter or I don't know, Linear, who knows what. Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of organizations have it messed up. I think there's this draw towards we got to move fast, right? Start early, start quick. And we don't want anything to slow us down. And so many teams and so many applications bring in so many dependencies in thinking that, oh, this is smart. We're moving fast. One of the things that I hope to keep bringing into the Rails community, into the Rails ecosystem, is that when we learn our tools well, it's possible to move fast without just dumping dependency after dependency after dependency into our applications, right? So if we practice, if we are studious and we are watching YouTube videos, reading blogs, building side applications, we can get to a place, as we'll see tomorrow, where I'm going to build a full OAuth integration with a third-party provider in, I don't know, 30 or 40 minutes. That is not slower than bringing in OmniAuth and doing all the same configuration. Like it takes 30 minutes. It always takes 30 minutes. Just because I'm building it from scratch doesn't mean it takes me 3 days. It'll also take me 30 minutes because I know those tools. I know these patterns. I know the OAuth flow. Like I've studied these things. And as engineers, we have the opportunity to demonstrate that we can do things that are useful for the business, right? Like that's a real business need. We shouldn't be wasting time, especially early on in a project, just building things for the sake of building things, right? Like we need this business to exist, to make money so that we can feed our families, right? The business case there is very real, but there are different possible ways in which we can set the foundations for an application, set the foundations for a system, such that over time, if and when that business does find a footing, does reach some degree of product market fit, and we start to grow the code base, we start to grow the team, that we aren't feeling all of the growing pains that are so common for developers to lament as they get into things. And I think that the root of many of those pains are decisions that are made in haste early on in a project because too few people have the confidence in their tools to take ownership over their tools and to build things with those tools instead of just bundle, add, bundle, add, bundle, add. So anyway, see everybody tomorrow and we will finish this up. Looking forward to it.